All right, everyone. Welcome to our event this evening. My name is Adam Levine. I'm Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies here at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. And I am very pleased to invite and welcome Malika Saada Saar, who is a human rights lawyer by training and also serves as YouTube's global head of human rights right now. She leads the platform's efforts in working alongside activists, nonprofits, and external partners to advance human rights issues, including in the areas of criminal justice reform, gender equality, and racial justice. She was previously Google's senior counsel on civil and human rights, so has a long background in this arena. Prior to her time at Google and YouTube, Malika was a leader in the nonprofit community, having founded and served as executive director of both Rights for Girls and the Rebecca Project for Human Rights. She also served on the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS during the Obama administration. Newsweek and the Daily Beast have named her as one of 150 women who shake the world. Malika holds a BA from Brown University, an MA in education from Stanford University, and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. She has been honored by Georgetown Law Center's esteemed Robert F. Drinan Award for Public Service and by Brown University's highest alumni award, the Roger Williams Award. So please join me in welcoming her today for this wonderful question and answer period. So I'll start with some questions here, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions afterwards. And we have two mics here at either end. We ask that you stand up to one of the mics to ask your questions. All right. Well, let me start, if I can, by welcoming you back to your alma mater here.
It's an honor.
It's wonderful to have you back here again, and thank you for taking the time to chat with us today.
Absolutely.
If you don't mind, I'm sure the students, especially in the crowd, and others would love to hear a little bit about your journey from Brown University to becoming global head of human rights for YouTube. What really motivated you to get started on this career path, and how did it work out for you?
Yeah, well, I often talk about how so much of what I am and what I've done is because of this institution. You know, when I was here, there was a very deep, abiding belief that you do the work of justice, that you come to the school to learn how to do it, to create community around doing that, and to understand how you need to prepare yourself for that kind of work, and that it wasn't just work, it was about who you are as a human being. And you know, I was here when we were fighting for need-blind admissions, and that was absolutely critical to my development, because you know, there was the idea that you have a moral belief. Maybe you take over the president's office because of that moral belief, but then we also had to present what we were fighting for to the Board of Trustees. And that process, that experience was critical for me in terms of understanding what it means to show moral courage, but then also what it means to create the strategy and the argument behind the moral belief. And I also had the honor of, you know, professors who cared about me. So, you know, Professor Ross Chait was my mentor. And I remember when I graduated, he gave me a book about Saul Alinsky, right? And it was kind of that experience of Brown, of saying to you that if you choose to do the work of justice, there are mentors and there's a community for you to support you in that. And that really mattered to me. I went on because there was another professor here, Ted Sizer, who told us all that the revolution was going to happen in the school system. And there were a number of us who really believed that and really learned from him and wanted to be teachers. And so I went to Stanford, to the School of Education, and then realized that for me, the revolution was not going to happen in the school system. And that I wanted to be a grassroots organizer because I had seen the way the kids that I taught were suffering with injustice every day. And so could I be part of challenging those systems of oppression as a grassroots organizer? And I did that work in the Bay Area at a time when we were fighting for families who were homeless, who because of their homelessness, they lost their children, which of course made no sense, especially because there were few family programs, family shelters for folks to go to. So I worked a lot as an organizer in understanding how to approach policy. And then, realized that nobody was really listening to me because I was a grassroots organizer, but they were listening to the lawyers. So it made me decide I gotta get a law degree. Got my law degree. During law school, I was very clear that I didn't want to do corporate law. I didn't want to do legal services. I really wanted to create my own. And I was fascinated by the conversation around human rights law, because the classes that I took on civil rights law showed me how gutted civil rights law was. And so I was very interested in human rights law, and out of law school set up my own nonprofit, which was a really interesting experience. And that work, both the Rebecca Project and Rights for Girls, was really about how do we take human rights law and understand the use of it within the US and at a global scale. And my focus was on gender-based violence, as well as issues of criminal justice and trafficking. I had done a lot of work around how our girls were being incarcerated. So, we have had a long conversation in this country around the school to prison pipeline. But what I was seeing was that so many girls were being locked up. And the reason why they were being locked up was because of the status offense of running away from home. But then you would ask the girls, why are you running away from your homes, foster care or your own biological homes? And they would say, because they were being abused. So, for women who run, we give them protection and shelter. When our girls run, we lock them up. And then I started learning from the girls that many of them had been bought and sold. And that pushed me into the anti-trafficking work and the criminal justice reform work for girls, and that very thin divide between our girls who are locked up from the experience of abuse and our girls who are being bought and sold and locked up. And at the time, I did a lot of work with Google because they wanted to be a good actor in the anti-trafficking space. And I had a wonderful partnership with Google around ending the laws that were incarcerating our children for child prostitution. If you can imagine, even though many girls weren't even of legal age to consent, all across the country, they were being locked up on child prostitution charges or related prostitution charges. And we worked with LA County, the largest county in the country, to basically end that criminalization of girls who were being trafficked. And Google invited me to come on board, and I was like, why? What would I do at Google? And I had an amazing vice president who said, figure it out. Figure out what you want to do as a human rights lawyer in this space. And she gave me the support and the protection to be able to really carve out the role of a human rights lawyer at Google. And it has been a powerful journey, but I certainly did not go to law school to become a human rights lawyer for Google. And although I'm proud to be at the company, I am most proud of the work that I did on the ground as a human rights lawyer.
Absolutely. Well, we'll definitely want to hear more about some of the work you're doing now, but I'm very curious, you had mentioned, of course, that you have a law degree, and I'm curious how important do you think having that legal background is to working in human rights, or are there other pathways into human rights as well, beyond the sort of traditional legal?
I do think there are other pathways into human rights work, and I think what's important is to be committed to the work of human rights and to figure out what is your journey around that. as a woman and as a woman of color, it was very important for me to get that law degree. I saw, as a community organizer, the way those with law degrees were treated and heard. And I felt like I had to get that anointment. And I don't regret that. I think for me, that was the right move. But you know, what I talk about now is for those who want to do human rights law, the importance of not only defining our place in the NGO space, or in legal services, or in certain even corporate spaces, the importance of being able to say that human rights lawyers belong in the tech sector, and that others who believe in human rights belong in the tech sector. I think that is a place where our voices have to be heard. And it was something that I would never have contemplated before, but is very clear to me that this intersection of human rights and technology, of human rights lawyers being technologists, is absolutely critical.
You mentioned some of your work around the rights of women and girls, and a little bit about some of the major issues facing them. Can you talk a little bit about why women and girls are disproportionately affected by human rights abuses, and what some of the work looks like now that's trying to prevent those human rights abuses?
Well, look, I think gender-based violence is a systemic form of violence against women and girls that is true in this country and at global scale. I think that there has been tremendous work done around trying to disrupt how systemic that violence is against us. It was an amazing moment to see the Me Too movement happen. You know, before I came to Google, I was very focused on trying to end the culture of impunity for those who buy our children. Because if you look at who gets criminalized in the US and globally, rarely are the individuals who purchase children for sex criminalized. There is a culture of impunity towards them here and globally. So to see Me Too happen, right, which was a direct opportunity to talk about that culture of impunity, was very meaningful. But I think that there's so much more work to be done. And I think that we've been hurt by so many setbacks to reproductive health and reproductive justice, setbacks around nations where we saw more girls entering schools and now that being shut down, the continued lack of access girls have to education, the continued subjecting girls' bodies to child marriage. All of that continues. All of that is a place of violence. And part of my belief in being in the digital space is that it's also clear that the digital space is the new space of violence against women and girls. And so how do we talk about that, and how do we, as tech companies, be able to address that and disrupt that? That has been a huge part of my thinking and work at the company.
Well, let's get into that now, because you know, when people think about the role of big tech in this world, promoting human rights is not always the first thing that comes to mind. Can you provide some examples of the ways that technology companies are working to promote human rights, both here in the United States and also around the world?
Yeah. Well, we have human rights teams, right? So we have that at Meta, we have that at Alphabet, we had that at Twitter, but she was just fired, she and her team. So I do think that there's an emerging understanding on the part of the tech sector that human rights lawyers have to be part of the work of the companies, that what we do in this space has huge human rights implications, not just in terms of who and what happens with our supply chains, but what happens on our platforms. I also think that there's been a really interesting tension that we've seen over the years around these platforms who deeply believed in being spaces of free speech, coming to the recognition that not all speech is good speech and not all speech is free speech, right? That there is hate speech. And the work of these companies in being able to discern what is hate speech and what is free speech, and how important human rights lawyers are in that discourse. And then I'm also, as a human rights lawyer, fascinated by how do we use these technologies as human rights tools, right? So, you know, when you're a human rights lawyer, what you're trained to do is bear witness, right? You document the human rights abuse so that the world may bear witness. And thinking about how do we use these tools of mobile devices and global platforms to now bear witness. I talked earlier about, you know, we have this movie that looks at the courage of Mamie Till when her son was dragged out of the home and lynched and mutilated. Mamie Till said, "I want his body to be seen." And the insistence that the world bear witness to what white supremacy did to her child, right? And because of that act of courage and how she forced the world to bear witness, a civil rights movement played out. We look at Darnella Frazier, right? And her courage to take out her phone as a human rights tool to document a modern day lynching and share that video on global platforms that then created a movement. That's my belief in the intersection of tech and human rights, that we have these platforms and these mobile devices that we can leverage as human rights tools so that the world bears witness when there are human rights abuses. We've seen this play out in Syria. We've also seen that when we have human rights movements, what is the first thing that a government will do to shut down the movement? They'll turn off the internet. That's what's happening in Iran right now. So that is the place of my truth. And I'm always interested in what other ways can we think about these technologies from a human rights perspective. So one of the things that I'm most proud of at YouTube is that we took the technology of VR to scale the prison walls to be able to show the experience of a child behind bars. And what VR allows for is actually in first person, feeling as if you are a child, right? And using that VR experience of feeling as if you are that kid in an adult prison, creating that content and then giving it to NGOs to use in their advocacy around ending adult prison sentences for children. And creating that content, by the way, with adults who had been incarcerated as children. Again, we don't think about VR as an experience of adjacency or proximity to human rights abuses, but this is a way we can do that. How do we think about AR, augmented reality, in the same way? So that's the place of my belief, fully aware of how technology can also be leveraged to surveil our bodies and to deny our human rights. But where I work and where I live is in that place of how can we leverage it for good.
So human rights are sometimes criticized as a Western construct, for instance. And working for a global company like YouTube as its global head of human rights, you must work with people all over the world. And do you find yourself having to navigate conflicting views in the different places you operate about the universality of some or all human rights?
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, I don't work for an NGO. At the end of the day, I work for a publicly traded company. So I see those tensions all the time, right? A government asks us to take down content. From my perspective, that's a difficult decision. I'm not always comfortable in those spaces, but what I remember is that I have to be in those spaces because I don't necessarily get to call the shots there, but the importance of a human rights perspective be put into the room, I think is absolutely critical. And it's also important to understand those tensions in terms of my own effectiveness, because if I walk in there without an appreciation for that, then I won't be heard. So it has taught me kind of the the importance of you know, when I was in law school, it was all about how do we sue these companies, right? That's what I wanted to do. That's what I was taught to do. It was never about how do we work within these companies. And so you know, my learning curve has been going from the human rights lawyer who wanted to sue the companies, right, to being the human rights lawyer in the room wanting to have the credibility to be heard by the powers that be.
So, as you said, you work for a tech company, but I'm sure that you collaborate with many different types of individuals and organizations, including many NGOs around the world. Tell me a little bit about the types of individuals and organizations you partner with here in the US and all over the world.
So this is what I love, right? Because this is my tribe, right? I come out of the human rights community. And I also come out of how hard it is to do the NGO work. I was on the NGO side for over 15 years. There are very few people who come from my background in tech. So I get to work with human rights organizations and try to figure out how to center their work on the platform. I get to also be a bridge between the grievances that they have with the company and creating an opportunity for them to give voice to those grievances with our leadership. That bridging has been not just in terms of connecting leadership with human rights organizations, with human rights defenders, but also it's a different language. You know, like the language that I was taught in law school that I use through the NGO years is very different than the language that gets spoken within tech. And so part of my role has also been learning how to braid together those languages so that human rights organizations, human rights defenders are heard, and also talking to human rights organizations and activists about the importance of understanding that, you know, our work in the 20th century was very much about how do we change law and culture and economics to be just. And now in the 21st century, it is a conversation of those spaces of power and tech, and talking to those rights organizations and defenders about how do we also make sure that the work for equity, the work of justice, the work of human rights is also within the tech space. And I think the human rights community and the human rights activist world is slowly learning that, but it is slow moving. And yet it is an absolutely critical area where we have to have that language of tech and human rights, not simply on the side of the companies, but on the side of the organizations and the activists.
So you've talked a bit about the positive role that technology companies can have on human rights and technologies in general. But what responsibilities do tech companies have to ensure that their platforms are not used by governments or other actors to spread misinformation, undermine civil rights, or, in the worst case, instigate violence against particular groups? And in practice, how do you find that they fulfill these responsibilities?
Yeah, so, you know, in my world, so much of my time is spent around guidelines and rules on hate and harassment, how they are enforced, being able to always try to be in a proactive place around these struggles that we have. My role has also been in making sure that these different teams that are looking at issues around content and hate speech and harassment also understand the larger political and historical context in which they make those decisions, that those decisions do not happen in isolation. But I think this is a very difficult area, right? And I've seen also, very much to my frustration, the way companies have now made wiser decisions around content on the platform, only to see, right, the emergence of 4chan, right? So doing the right thing in terms of hate and harassment, and yet recognizing that it's not simply about what happens on our platform, but the constellation of platforms and how that plays out. I had a front seat to so much of the work that we did around COVID misinformation, and just seeing how we're constantly chasing our tail, right? But the importance of YouTube making the decision around shutting down, removing content that spreads misinformation around COVID and vaccinations. We also made that decision around abortion, which I thought was a critical decision. And again, it's the challenge, though, is not just those decisions, but the decisions that other platforms make and don't make.
Are there any new technologies on the horizon that you think hold particular promise for promoting human rights, or alternatively ones that you're particularly concerned about in the decades to come?
I'll start on the good side. And the good side is, you know, I'm very, very hopeful around technologies that we can create to verify content to be used in crimes against humanity, in war crimes. I think there's a lot of opportunity around forensic to verify that this content can be used as evidence in prosecution by the ICC, and other opportunities to hold accountable those who are systemic violators of human rights. I think some of the technology that's also happening around blurring identity is critical for the privacy and security of our human rights defenders. You know, I think that there are real opportunities of how AI can be used from a place of good and of human rights, in terms of how do we use AI around climate change, how do we use AI around identifying trafficking patterns. And then I'm also very aware of the ways in which we are at an existential moment in how we can see technologies being weaponized against us, right? So, you know, the ways in which predictive policing disproportionately will impact Black men and the criminalization of Black men. The way that AI can also be a very dangerous tool in surveillance and in our human rights. The way facial recognition doesn't discern Black and brown bodies. The way deepfakes also pose other problems around human rights standards. So I think that, you know, part of what I have been trying to push for and think about and believe in is, how do we innovate from a rights-based perspective? And how is that part of the languaging in moving forward, so that when we talk about human rights, we have an opportunity to innovate from that place of rights and dignity, so that we can talk about technologies and products that advance our human rights as opposed to put us in jeopardy. And that is why I think, you know, the importance of human rights lawyers being in this space, as well as technologists having exposure to what human rights are. None of this is neutral, right? Algorithms are not neutral. Algorithms exist in the context of racist structures, of misogynistic structures. And so the work of being able to make sure that in how we innovate, in what we create as technologies and products, that it's not about the reproduction of bias, it's about dismantling bias. And I think we have a lot of work to do in that, but I think that that's what we have to push for.
Okay. So in just a moment, we're going to open it up to questions from the crowd. And so I'd encourage you to start going up to one of the microphones if you do have a question. But just before we turn it over, one last question for you. I'm sure many of the students here in our audience would love to hear your words of advice for those who are interested in careers in human rights. I'm sure many of them are, because this is Brown and they're here at this talk. So, you know, what advice do you have for those who are just thinking about launching careers in this area?
You know, I think this is, especially right now, is just a remarkable time to be doing human rights work. I think I would also invite you to be on the ground, because no matter where you go afterwards, there is nothing like being on the ground, to be there around the work that is happening with activists, to support activists, to be part of the, you know, the struggle that is visceral for so many who are fighting either for climate justice, gender justice, racial justice. I also think that there is power in being on the ground, and then power in taking those lessons from the ground and being part of the think tanks, part of the legislative bodies, part of the UN entities. But I believe very deeply in starting on the ground, so that when you become part of those entities, you have an understanding of the human toll of our policies and of our studies and of our work. And too often, there is a separateness that plays out in those spaces between how we think about research and policy and what people are living through. So, I have a very deep belief in the importance of always understanding this work in terms of human beings and never losing that. And I think we also have a responsibility, because so much has been given to us, to really center survivor leadership. So those who are being impacted by those human rights violations, what is your work in centering their leadership, their voices, their work? And then how do you take that through your career so that you are always holding yourself accountable to the individuals who are most hurt and impacted by these violations of justice and dignity? I don't think that I would be useful where I am right now if I didn't do over 15 years in the human rights space. I think that my voice at Google and YouTube is an outlier voice because of where I come from, and I think that's my value added. And so I think I would just always encourage the being connected to the ground, holding yourself accountable to those individuals, centering their leadership, and always making sure that you wrestle with how you're doing this work. Because it's hard and it's not always clear. But I think it's such a critical time for us to be doing the work.
Great. Well, everyone now has the opportunity. Can we ask anyone who would like to ask a question? Please come up to the mic.
Hi, thanks for this. I'm curious about, I'm just wondering, so one of the problems with the social media platforms, of course, is the way in which their own internal amplification algorithms spread the kinds of problems that you then have to deal with on the human rights side, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's other places. So, not to pick on, YouTube is one of them, there are many others, right? But in your position where you're trying to essentially tamp down and manage the sort of the hate that's spewing, the problem also that some of that is spewing because of the choices and the designs of the systems that these companies are using. And I'm curious, when you've had to have those conversations internally, what has it been like to try and have those conversations when you're essentially trying to deal with situations that in part are caused by the actions of the companies that you're working with?
Yeah, we had a really fascinating summit last year. It was an internal executive leadership summit where it was on radicalization online around white supremacy. And we brought in individuals who had been radicalized as white supremacists on the platform. And it was just a very powerful opportunity to understand what played out so we could understand what is our responsibility to disruption around that radicalization. I also have, struggled around, how do you, when we talk about hate speech, how do you do that when there are 40,000 hours of content uploaded every minute just on the YouTube platform alone? And where some of these situations, you can't rely on machines to discern, right? Where hate is in coded language that is particular to that region of the country or that region of the world. So I have much more appreciation for how challenging the gray is. I was talking earlier about looking at hateful stereotypes and understanding that when we look at hateful stereotypes, there is no such thing as a good stereotype, right? Like when we look at the model minority stereotype. It might seem like a good stereotype, but it is rooted in hatred. So what are the implications of that in terms of what we have on our platform and what we take off? And how do we also honor, and I think about this as a human rights lawyer, the importance of free expression, right? As well as the parameters around hate speech. So I think that I've grown far more aware of how difficult the gray is. And I've been very clear also of the opportunities to bring in those who have been radicalized, those who can talk to us from a human rights perspective, from the perspective of critical race theory and hate speech, and making sure that all of those voices are part of how we struggle with these questions. I don't think they're easy, and I think that there's still so much more work to be done, and the importance of doing it across companies, because it's not gonna work if it's just within one company.
Other questions?
Hi. What do you consider to be the role of governmental legislation in this space, given the issue that you were just alluding to about sort of gaps in regulating internally, and then this is a global company that, you can't really control everything through legislation, but also if there's nothing in place legally, it's all on the burden of the companies to be taking action. So do you work directly with people in government? What's your sort of, how do you reckon with that?
Yeah, I don't work directly with people in government. I did when I was on the Google side. Glad that chapter is over. Look, I believe that, here's what I'm very clear on, right? After doing years of policy work, legislative work for human rights, technology moves much faster than law. And often, I think you all have seen this, a lot of our lawmakers in the US don't always understand technology, right? So my interest has been recognizing that we can innovate quicker than we can be legislated. How do we innovate from that place of rights and justice? Because if we can create products from a place of human rights respect, it can happen quicker than issues of legislation. So that's been my area of interest, seeing how long it takes for lawmakers to catch up. I also think that there's a lot of power in these tech companies creating guidelines that are in adherence to human rights standards. I shared earlier that before I came over to Google, I heard Paul Pullman, who at the time was the CEO of Unilever, give a speech, and I didn't want to be at this reception. Unilever gave my NGO some money, so I had to show up to the reception, and he just started talking about how companies could have as much impact on human rights as government and civil society. And it was the most radical speech I had heard in years. And I don't think I would have gone to Google if I actually didn't hear that speech, because it made me think differently about human rights standards and areas of opportunity and change. So I do think that there's something about pushing tech sector corporations to really have these high human rights standards as an example to civil society and governments of what can be done.
And then the accountability is within consumers?
Absolutely. And I said this earlier, like, it's all about you Gen Zs, man, because in my generation was about saying philanthropy, CSR, right? Like, we want to see corporations give to grassroots organizations, all of the work that was languaging that. And what you all are saying is forget that. It's all about how, as a company, do you adhere to sustainability? Do you really talk about racial justice that's not performative? And that approach and that form of activism from Gen Zs is why I can be at YouTube, right? And why there's more and more openings for a human rights perspective and a justice perspective at these companies. And I think that that is more powerful than anything else.
Other questions? Oh.
You mentioned the speech that the head of Unilever had given, and that speech kind of rocked the international humanitarian community. Would you mind speaking, since you have experience on both sides, the fact that a lot of organizations were a little bit taken aback by the idea that large corporations could come into this sector and make change. And then on the other side, you see quite a few heads of corporations now pushing that forward. Do you see that being as like the new way forward, or as a discussion that needs to continue to play out? Or do you see that as being something that we need to explore further?
Well, I do, thank you for the question. I do think it is important. I do also think that we all should still be held accountable, right? It's not enough to say it, right? It cannot be performative, and I think it is important to be held accountable for those statements. I think that's really happened with the racial justice movement, and I think we need to absolutely see more of that. I also think that none of this works when it's only in one part, right? Like, we have to see this within corporations, we have to see it within government, we have to see it within civil society. All of it has to be in this place of creating, reimagining and rethinking these conversations around justice and human rights. And if it's tethered to only one part, to only one entity, it's not going to work. So I think that's why I think when we talk about what does it mean to take a path, a career path in human rights, the importance of thinking about ourselves everywhere, because we need to be everywhere.
Please, come up.
Hi. So you mentioned before that you often find yourself in uncomfortable spaces where you might not call all the shots, but you see a lot of inherent value in just being present in those spaces. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about what that process is like for you personally, just knowing that you being there is important, but you might not be able to control the outcomes all the time.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. And I come back to this institution and what this institution gave me, right? Which is the belief that if you work from the place of your moral courage, you are always whole. I mean, that really Brown gave me that in the most fundamental way. And so when I feel that sense of being an outlier, which can often feel very frightening, right? I think it's coming back to my center. And, I also come back to the privilege that I have and the responsibility. I had the chance to work alongside survivor leaders who, from the age of 10 to 18, had been bought and sold. And they had the courage to stand alone in front of a room of members of Congress and tell their story and demand their justice. Their courage is part of what grounds me, that if they could do that, then I have no excuse but to be in the room and to dig into my own place of centeredness and speak my truth. And I think it's also about recognizing that you have a responsibility to always be in a place of speaking your truth, especially when you've been given so much privilege. So I very much lean into that. And And I very much am clear on my utility in that way, and that if I don't continue to speak from the place of being the outlier, that there's no point in me being there. Then I'm just like any other individual who, doesn't come out of an NGO background. So I remind myself of those who are far more courageous than me and what they've done, and my responsibility.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Absolutely.
Probably have time for one or two more questions. You please come up.
Hi, so I have a question about what you and people like you in terms of human rights activists and lawyers in the tech space do when there's kind of a conflict between the conflict that is recent because tech and tech corporations and government are either having a contract together, for example, Project Nimbus of Google, or there's a pressure from government, let's say, for example, introducing backdoors of encryptions inside whatever platform that they are creating or whatever software they're creating that should have encryption. So can you talk a little about like, what you and people of your space trying to reconcile with those potential conflicts and how you imagine solving it at all? Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. So I see my responsibility in this space to making sure that human rights defenders who are bringing that up around encryption or other issues are heard by the company, right? So that there's not simply a lack of knowledge around their grievance or a lack of conversation around their grievances. So that is my first and foremost responsibility, is to make sure that there is dialogue and connection between human rights organizations and defenders and those individuals and teams that are making certain decisions. Again, sometimes, I'm really happy by outcomes and sometimes I'm not, but I believe in the importance of this new and emerging space of bringing us into these companies to make sure that those human rights arguments are part of the contemplation of what we do. It's dangerous when there's not that contemplation, and it's dangerous when there is working in isolation and disconnect from those organizations and human rights defenders. And I think I would add to that the importance of 5, 10, 15 years from now, it's not just one person, right? That we have a larger presence in these spaces. We're a 15-person team as opposed to 1 or 2.
Hello. It seems like from the other questions that people have asked that, a lot of times top-down solutions to these problems can be difficult, whether because, the sort of the speed of lawmaking or because, things travel really fast on the internet and it's a big internet, things can go from platform to platform or across countries. And I'm sure, in your experience as a grassroots organizer, you've seen sort of the power of more bottom-up solutions, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, and maybe this sort of came out when you heard from folks who were radicalized on the platform, what can be done to, I guess, kind of activate users who are on the platform and don't always know that they are maybe falling into those sort of pitfalls. And, I've heard that a lot of people who kind of end up in these more radicalized spaces don't even know that they were heading there until they're already there.
Yeah.
And sort of what role the platform can have in I guess, educating people on that when they're using them.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's this whole science around inoculation. It's also called pre-bunking, where it is giving information to individuals about how to discern what they are seeing as a form of inoculation. And there is a project within our company called Jigsaw that actually worked with some YouTube creators to set up these types of pre-bunking videos. And I'm fascinated by it, right? And I do think that, you know, the research has been very, very interesting in saying how effective pre-bunking is. And so that's an area that YouTube is interested in terms of how do we create digital literacy, right? Because that's part of digital literacy. And I know that we are doing a lot of work around that in the year ahead, and also trying to, with an eye towards World Refugee Day, how can we think about working with UNHCR, for instance, in developing some of those pre-bunking videos. I have to tell this amazing story that is connected in some ways to pre-bunking. One of the individuals who was radicalized on the platform, and his name escapes me, but there was a New York Times article about him. He was doing a lot of the video work for one of these white supremacist organizations. And he was set to go to one of the refugee camps in the effort to like create content to show how horrible, right, these refugee camps are and these individuals, and really like, you know, adding to that whole great replacement theory narrative. And he gets to one of these areas where it's a campground of refugees in Greece. And he realizes that these are just like mothers and fathers and children who are just trying to seek a better life. And he realizes that he's been wrong. That is the opportunity for pre-bunking, right? How he can tell that story. And similar types of stories can be told of the vulnerability around these narratives of hatred, and then what disrupts and breaks the narrative of hatred. And so I'm very interested in how do we work with human rights organizations to build on that type of pre-bunking work.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us this evening. We have a reception afterwards. Hopefully people will stick around, and I'm sure be willing to take a couple more questions there. But everyone else, please join me in thanking Malika Saar for joining us today.